The Galactic Empire was a force that no one could challenge. Its fleets, stretched across the stars. Its technology was light years ahead of anything any race had ever produced, and its strategies were flawless to them. The universe was their playground, and all who dared to cross them would be crushed without a second thought. When the small human ship, the U.S. Vanguard, drifted into the Empire's territory, it was hardly considered a blip on their radar to the Empire. This was just another reckless species hoping to prove their worth, but incapable of doing so. The ship was old, its technology seemed laughable, and its crew nothing more than misguided fools out of their league. The Empire's warships hovered over the ship effortlessly, their sleek design cutting through the darkness of space like predators circling their prey. The humans were far beneath them, but they would give the humans a chance to surrender first. The Empire had no need to engage in a battle that would be over before it began. Commander Thrax surveyed the scene from his flagship. As he watched the human ship on the screen, he chuckled to himself. He had seen many races fall before the might of the Empire, but humans had always intrigued him. They were an arrogant young species filled with ambition, but they were too immature to understand the true nature of power. They tried to fight back against their own problems with crude technology and primitive tactics. It was almost cute, but ultimately useless to him. The battle was already won before it had begun. He knew they would fold and surrender without putting up a real fight, but that was no fun, was it? So he decided to have a little sport. Thrax turned to his officers and gave a simple command: send a message to the humans, tell them to prepare for their inevitable surrender. The Empire would accept their futile plea for mercy, but it would not stop their fate from being sealed. He leaned back in his chair and smiled as he awaited the response to the message. He was certain it would be the same as all the others throughout history: a quick plea for their lives, a promise to never resist again. The message went out across the vastness of space to the human ship, and Thrax waited. The seconds stretched into minutes, but there was no response. Instead, the humans did something unexpected. They did not answer at all. No cries for mercy, no requests for help, just silence. Thrax raised an eyebrow. Was this some sort of trick? Surely they could not be so foolish as to ignore the Empire's warning. Just then something strange happened. The screen flickered and a blip appeared. The ship's coordinates were shifting erratically. What was going on? Thrax thought. Was this an attempt at escape? The ship was far too small and slow to evade them, yet it was moving as if trying to flee the Empire's grasp. Thrax's curiosity grew, and with it his sense of superiority. He ordered the fleet to move in closer, confident that this was just a last-ditch effort by the humans to avoid their inevitable end. But as the Empire's warships closed in, they saw something that would shake their confidence to the core. A single shot rang out from the human ship, and suddenly an Empire officer fell dead, his body crumpling to the ground. No warning, no explosion, no signs of attack, just a body dropping lifelessly to the floor. Thrax's face went cold. The humans were not fleeing at all. They had made a shot. They had killed someone without anyone even seeing it. Captain Daniel Hayes stood in the command center of the U.S. Vanguard, staring at the screen in front of him. He had been in enough battles to know that the situation had shifted when the Empire sent a fleet into human territory. It was always a bad sign, but this time something was different. The Empire's arrival was not just an invasion. It was a declaration of contempt. They didn't just want to subdue the humans. They wanted to show them their place in the galaxy. They wanted to break their spirit before they even started to fight. Hayes knew that they were being underestimated, and that would be their greatest advantage. Sergeant Lawson, report, Hayes said without taking his eyes off the screen, his voice calm but purposeful. The tension in the room was palpable, but Hayes had learned long ago how to keep his focus in the heat of battle. Lawson wasn't just any soldier. She was the Vanguard's best sniper, a woman of few words, but a deadly shot. Her reputation had spread through the ranks of the human military and beyond. But here, in the quiet moments before the storm, she was the one who had the power to turn the tide. From her position in the highest tower of the Vanguard, Sarah Lawson surveyed the battlefield. She knew that the humans were outmatched. She knew that their chances of survival against the Empire's fleets were slim. But she also knew something the Empire didn't understand. It wasn't about the size of the enemy or the number of ships or weapons. It was about how they fought. It was about knowing when to strike And when to wait, it was about patience. The Empire was too used to overwhelming their opponents with sheer force. They had no idea how to deal with someone who would wait until the perfect moment to act. "Commander, we're ready." Lawson's voice crackled over the comms, clear and steady. She had positioned herself in a place where the Empire would least expect her, a place where they couldn't predict her movements, and most importantly, a place where she could strike when they were vulnerable. She wasn't worried about their technology or their numbers. She was confident in one thing: herself and her rifle. She knew that her shot would make the difference. The Empire fleet moved closer, their massive ships dwarfing the Vanguard in size and firepower. But Lawson didn't flinch. She had been in situations like this before. She knew how to remain invisible, how to blend into the surroundings, how to move without being seen. She was the predator, and the Empire was the prey. As the first wave of Empire soldiers prepared to board the Vanguard, Lawson took her position. She raised her rifle, steadying herself against the wind, and adjusted the scope as she locked onto her target. She took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and then squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like a clap of thunder in the stillness of space. But it wasn't the sound that mattered, it was the result. The first officer of the Empire's fleet fell without a sound, his body crumpling to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The Empire had no idea what had hit them. The soldiers who had been preparing to storm the ship froze, their faces contorted in confusion. Thrax, who had been overseeing the assault from his flagship, froze as well, his expression shifting from smug confidence to something darker, something uncertain. He had been so sure that this would be a quick and easy victory, but this one shot had shattered his certainty. As he looked at the screen in front of him, he saw the body of his officer and realized something had gone horribly wrong. The silence that followed the shot was deafening. Thrax stared at the screen in disbelief, his mind racing as his officers scrambled to assess what had happened. How had one of his fleet's senior officers fallen with no warning, no sign of attack? His face twisted with confusion and then anger. This couldn't be right. He had underestimated the humans, but now they were proving to be far more dangerous than he had imagined. "Commander, what are your orders?" one of his subordinates asked hesitantly, breaking the stillness of the moment. Thrax clenched his fists, his thoughts churning. He had no intention of letting this small human ship get the better of him. They had embarrassed him enough already, but he would not allow that to continue. The time for questioning had passed. It was time for action. "Move in," Thrax growled, his voice low and controlled. "We're going to board that ship and capture their captain. Let's end this charade once and for all." He turned to face the view screen, his eyes locked onto the Vanguard now, a tiny speck against the backdrop of space. But that tiny speck was defying him, and he couldn't stand it. His fleet surged forward as Thrax issued orders for a full assault. The ships descended upon the Vanguard. As planned, the Empire's soldiers were trained for operations like this. They knew how to handle insurgents and minor resistance. But this was supposed to be a quick mission: take down the ship, intimidate the crew, and force their surrender. That was how it always went, and yet the first shot had thrown that into chaos. On the Vanguard, Captain Hayes watched the unfolding situation with a level of calm that belied the circumstances. He had been through enough fights to know that this was only the beginning. If anything, it was a sign that they were already in the heads of the Empire soldiers. But he knew they couldn't afford to get too confident now. If the Empire was sending in soldiers to board their ship, it meant they had gone from simply wanting to overpower them to actively hunting them down like animals. "Sergeant Lawson," Hayes said without turning, "do what you do best." His words were simple, but his meaning clear. He knew Sarah had already made her mark. But they needed more than just a shot. They needed precision. They needed chaos to break the Empire's assault. And Sarah was the perfect weapon for that. In the highest tower of the Vanguard, Sarah Lawson adjusted her rifle. As she watched the Empire fleet close in, the enemy had moved with a calculated pace. But she had already anticipated their actions. She had been tracking their movements for hours, reading the battlefield not just for soldiers, but for weak points in the Empire's strategy, the way they positioned their forces, how they grouped and responded to her earlier shot. It all gave her the information she needed to strike again. She spotted the first group of Empire soldiers as they prepared to board their ship, moving into position to breach the Vanguard. Sarah's fingers tightened on the trigger as she lined up her target. But she didn't rush her shot. She had learned long ago that the best shot wasn't always the first one, it was the one that counted the most. She watched the soldiers carefully as they moved closer, taking a mental snapshot of their positions. The best moments were the ones when the enemy felt the safest, when they thought they were winning. One soldier stepped forward with a confident swagger, his blaster raised ready to break through the airlock. Sarah held her breath just for a moment, and then released it slowly. In one fluid motion, she pulled the trigger. The shot cut through the air with deadly precision, and the soldier fell with no chance to react. He crumpled to the floor like a rag doll. His comrades didn't even know where the shot had come from. At first, their eyes darted around the ship in confusion, but there was no sign of Sarah, not even a shadow of movement. A second shot rang out, and another soldier dropped. The panic had begun to spread again. As the chaos unfolded on the Vanguard, Thrax's anger boiled over. His confidence had been shattered by the unexpected precision of the human sniper, and now his soldiers were questioning everything. Every time they attempted to board the ship, they found themselves under attack, unaware of where the shots were coming from, only that they were losing men, and they were losing them fast. Thrax had ordered an immediate offensive, but was beginning to question the wisdom of his approach. "Commander, we've lost 3 more squads," one of his officers reported with a tone of growing concern. "The sniper is picking us off one by one. We can't pinpoint her position." Thrax's fists clenched, the frustration clear on his face. He had seen wars waged across the galaxy, had crushed rebellions with ease, and yet here he was, stymied by a single human sniper. "You want to take control," he barked, his voice cutting through the tension. "Then find that sniper and eliminate her. Now, I don't care if you have to level the entire ship to do it. I want her dead." The officer hesitated, but Thrax's glare was enough to snap him into action. He turned and rushed off to assemble a new strategy, though it was clear that the Empire had underestimated the humans' tactics. While they were used to fighting massive armies with overwhelming force, they had no contingency for the kind of guerrilla warfare humans excelled at, small, precise strikes that left enemies reeling. Back on the Vanguard, Captain Hayes observed the events unfolding with a calm that would have unnerved anyone who knew the odds they were facing. The Vanguard was no warship. It wasn't built to withstand a full-on assault from the Empire. But it had something that made it far more dangerous than any ship in the Empire's fleet: its crew. And Sergeant Sarah Lawson, hidden among them, was their greatest weapon. Hayes spoke into his comm device, his voice calm yet urgent. "Sergeant, they're starting to panic. You're doing great, but we need to keep them on the back foot. Don't let up. They think they're in control, but they're not. Use that." Sarah's voice came back, a calm and steady presence in the chaos. "I've got it, sir. They're getting sloppy. The more they push, the more they expose themselves. I'm waiting for them to make a mistake." The Empire's soldiers had begun clustering more tightly, trying to shield each other as they moved through the halls of the Vanguard in larger groups. They were relying on their numbers to overwhelm the ship's defenses, but they were doing exactly what Sarah had hoped for, making themselves easier to pick off. In her elevated position, Sarah watched as a group of 5 Empire soldiers filed into an airlock, unaware that they were walking directly into a trap. She had already set up multiple angles of fire, each one leading to another, ensuring that by the time they noticed one fallen soldier, they would be too late to save the rest. She allowed them to enter, all the while adjusting her aim and taking in every detail. The sniper knew the moment of their mistake would come, and when it did, she would be ready. And then it came. A soldier, trying to take cover behind a bulkhead, exposed his head just enough for her to see. Without hesitation, Sarah took the shot, and the soldier crumpled, his weapon falling to the floor. The others turned toward the noise, but it was too late. The second shot rang out with pinpoint accuracy, dropping another soldier before he could even react. The rest scrambled, their movements frantic as they tried to locate the shooter, but Sarah had already moved, already changed position. "What's happening?" Thrax barked from his command chair, his eyes darting around the screen in disbelief. "Why aren't we getting through?" His subordinate looked uneasy as he reported, "We've lost almost half our soldiers to this sniper. They're picking us off faster than we can move." Thrax's teeth ground together. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Humans, pathetic as they were, should not have been able to turn the tide of battle with one soldier. This wasn't supposed to be possible. "I want every officer in a direct assault formation. We go in together. No more scattered attempts. We find her and end this." He turned to his tactical officer. "And get those reinforcements ready. I want full ground support now." Back on the Vanguard, Sarah listened carefully, her eyes scanning the area. She knew that the Empire would soon change tactics and adapt to her hit-and-run strategy. But she was ready. She had the patience of a predator, and the Empire's arrogance had already played into her hands. The battlefield was hers to command now. The sniper was no longer just a soldier. She was the catalyst for the Empire's downfall. Every move they made played right into her hands. The Empire was starting to realize the depths of their miscalculation. Thrax's fury was palpable as he paced in front of the main view screen, watching his forces falter with every passing second. The sniper was not only a nuisance, she was becoming a nightmare. Her precision, her patience, it was as if she knew everything they were going to do before they did it. They had attempted to breach every entry point, but with each move they made, they found themselves ambushed, disoriented, and scattered. "Commander, we need to rethink our strategy." One of Thrax's officers ventured cautiously, but his words were barely audible over the growing tension in the room. "No," Thrax snapped. "We do not rethink. We do not back down. We crush them. All forces, advance. Prepare for hand-to-hand combat. This sniper cannot hide forever." His words, though filled with fury, only masked his growing unease. The Empire had always prided itself on its ability to swiftly quash any rebellion. But the humans were doing something no one had expected. They were turning the tables on the most powerful military force in the galaxy, and it was humiliating. Thrax wasn't used to losing control, and this one sniper, one human on a derelict ship, was making him look weak in front of his officers. On the Vanguard, Sarah Lawson remained composed as she reloaded her rifle. She could hear the faint sounds of the Empire soldiers advancing through the halls, their footsteps growing louder. They were getting closer, and she could sense their frustration. The Empire had adjusted their tactics. They were no longer trying to search the ship in a disorganized manner. Instead, they had begun to form a coordinated attack, moving through the Vanguard in tight-knit units. They had abandoned their earlier mistake of scattered assault and had now prepared for the kind of fight that Sarah was most dangerous in, close-quarters combat. She had expected this, of course. Sarah Lawson knew how they would respond. She had been counting on it. The Empire might be technologically advanced, but their hubris had clouded their judgment. They underestimated the humans. They underestimated her. The Vanguard was her terrain, and the ship's tight corridors gave her the advantage. Her sniper rifle was already tucked away, replaced by a smaller, more mobile sidearm. It wasn't about distance anymore. It was about precision, control, and the ability to stay one step ahead. She crouched low behind a series of crates, listening intently for the Empire's next move. She had to stay sharp. The enemy would be unpredictable now, and they were coming in fast. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes remained at the helm of the Vanguard, monitoring the battle from the control room. He had full faith in Sarah's abilities, but this wasn't just a one-person fight anymore. The rest of the crew was doing their part, holding their positions and defending the ship's weak points. But the Empire's assault was relentless. The ship groaned under the pressure, and Hayes knew they couldn't keep this up forever. "We need to buy more time," Hayes muttered, his hands moving swiftly across the command console. "Sarah, how much longer can you hold them off?" Sarah's voice crackled over the comms, low and steady. "Long enough," she said simply. She had no intention of allowing the Empire to get any closer to their goal. They thought they had her pinned, but they were wrong. It was time to finish this. As the first of the Empire soldiers turned the corner, Sarah made her move. She was a blur of motion, darting out from behind the crates and catching them off guard. The soldiers barely had time to react as she dropped two of them before they even saw her. The others scrambled for cover, trying to return fire, but Sarah was already gone, slipping into the shadows once more. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the Empire was running out of options. They had expected their sheer numbers to overpower the humans, but every time they thought they had gained ground, the sniper picked them off one by one. Sarah had turned the ship into a death trap, and the Empire was stumbling through it blindly. "Commander, we've lost contact with 4 of our teams," another officer reported, his voice shaky. "This is no longer just a sniper. It's like they know exactly where we're coming from." Thrax's expression darkened. This wasn't just a human on a ship. This was a force of nature. And now, it seemed, they had underestimated every aspect of the human spirit. They had underestimated the human resolve. "This ends now," Thrax growled, fury building inside him. "Prepare to launch an all-out attack. We'll flush them out. All of them." The Empire's strategy had shifted from cautious pursuit to full-on assault. Thrax had lost his patience, and his forces, sensing his growing desperation, began their final push. He had already committed everything they had: overwhelming numbers, brute force, and a complete disregard for subtlety. It was no longer about precision or capturing the vanguard intact. The plan was simple: obliterate everything. But in his haste, he had overlooked one key factor: the human spirit, particularly the one that embodied Sergeant Sarah Lawson. And that spirit was about to make the Empire regret their every move. Sarah was tracking their every movement, listening to the faint chatter of the Empire soldiers as they advanced. She had expected this final push. She knew they would come at her in force. The tighter they clustered, the more dangerous they became. But that wasn't a problem for her. She knew the layout of this ship better than anyone, and the Empire's soldiers were walking right into her hands. From a vantage point high above a corridor, she watched as the Empire soldiers flooded into the narrow passage, their boots echoing against the metal floor. Sarah's heart rate remained steady, her breathing even, as she took in the sight. The soldiers moved as one, covering each other's blind spots, forming a wall of power and arrogance. They were closing in on her, but it was exactly what she had planned. She waited. She let them draw closer. Then, in one fluid motion, Sarah dropped down from her perch, and as the first soldier turned, her pistol was already in his chest. The shot rang out in a split second, the soldier crumpling without a sound. The others barely had time to react before she was on the move again, dashing through the shadows, a ghost among them. One soldier, smarter than the rest, took a quick shot at the place he'd seen her disappear into the dark. But it was a wild shot. He was playing her game. Sarah didn't return fire. Instead, she moved closer, getting within a few feet of her target. She reached out, grabbing him from behind, spinning him into a headlock, and silencing him with a swift motion. As he slumped to the floor, she stole his weapon, a pulse rifle. The rest of the Empire soldiers were starting to realize something wasn't right, but it was already too late. Hayes watched the scene unfold on the bridge of the Vanguard. Through the security feeds, he could see Sarah's every move, calm, collected, and deadly. She was giving them exactly what they needed: time. Time for the crew to prepare. Time for them to make the final stand. But even as she fought, he could hear the explosions and the sounds of hull breaches. The Vanguard was taking damage, and they couldn't afford to drag this on much longer. "Captain, we're losing structural integrity in the aft sector," one of the officers shouted, eyes wide with urgency. "Patch the gaps," Hayes ordered, his voice firm. "Hold them off as long as you can. Sarah's giving us a chance to escape, but we need to keep them distracted." Back in the corridors, Sarah continued her dance of death. The Empire soldiers were becoming more erratic, more desperate. They knew they couldn't see her, but they had to flush her out, so they began to toss grenades, hoping for some random shot in the dark. It wasn't enough. Sarah knew where they would throw them before they even pulled the pins. She ducked, weaved, and fired with surgical precision. But just as she thought she had them cornered, a shift in the Empire's tactics took place. Thrax had finally learned his lesson. He wasn't going to let the sniper win. Overhead, massive transports began to descend toward the vanguard. Boarding parties were being deployed, and now there would be no place to hide. Sarah stopped, listening to the hum of the Empire's transports landing. They weren't giving up. They were sending in everything they had. She tightened her grip on the pulse rifle and knew it was time to finish this. In that moment, everything she had been fighting for, every shot, every maneuver, became clear. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for humanity's right to be more than just an afterthought in the galaxy. The Empire had mocked them, belittled them, and now it was time to prove that humanity would not kneel before anyone. The Empire had thought they were invincible. Now they would learn what it meant to face a species that was willing to fight for its future, no matter the cost. The tension on the vanguard was palpable. As the Empire's massive transports landed with a thundering crash, their landing gears screeching against the metal hull, the crew of the vanguard braced themselves for the storm that was about to hit. The Empire's boarding parties, heavily armored and armed with blasters, began to spill into the ship's corridors. They were here, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to flush out the human resistance and take the vanguard by force. Sarah Lawson, however, was ready. The moment the transports hit the deck, she knew they would come, and her plans had already accounted for this. The Empire had finally made their move. The soldiers were no longer just scattered squads trying to take her down. They were now organized, with their assault squads sweeping through the ship in waves. They would not stop until they had found every last one of them. From her position, Sarah could see the Empire troops advancing in squads. They had learned not to scatter, and they were covering every angle, checking every corner. But Sarah had always expected this, and she was prepared to fight them in the conditions that suited her best: darkness and tight spaces. She moved silently through the shadows, her pulse rifle at the ready, her senses sharp. The sound of the Empire soldiers' boots echoed off the walls, and Sarah knew that in a few moments the corridors would be filled with chaos. The Empire thought their reinforcements were going to crush the resistance, but Sarah had a different idea. She was going to make them pay for every inch they took. As the first wave of soldiers entered the hall, Sarah took her shot. A soldier at the front crumpled as the pulse blast hit him square in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. The others froze for a moment, confusion flashing in their eyes as they tried to locate the sniper. But Sarah wasn't where they thought she was. She had already slipped into a new position, watching as the soldiers scrambled in disarray, trying to make sense of the unexpected loss. Another shot rang out, and another soldier fell. The others attempted to fire back, but Sarah was already gone. Every time they thought they had her, she was somewhere else, using the ship's labyrinthine layout to her advantage. They were blind, and she was the predator. But just as Sarah was lining up another shot, a distant rumble shook the vanguard. The ship groaned, and the lights flickered briefly. Then came another explosion, this time from deeper within the ship. She knew what it was. The Empire had begun planting charges to breach the walls. They were determined to break through, and with each charge, the vanguard was taking more damage. The crew couldn't hold out forever. Captain Hayes had been monitoring the situation from the bridge. He knew Sarah was holding her own, but with every passing second, the Empire was gaining ground. He couldn't risk staying here much longer. The time had come to make a choice. The vanguard could either make a break for it, using the last of its fuel to escape, or it could remain and continue the fight, knowing full well that the Empire's reinforcements would eventually overwhelm them. "Status report," Hayes barked, his eyes fixed on the view screen as the vanguard shuddered from another blast. "We're holding the breach points, but the structural integrity is failing rapidly. If we don't make a move soon, "We'll be sitting ducks," one of the officers replied, a hint of fear in his voice. "Set the course for the nearest outpost," Hayes ordered, his decision clear. "We're not giving up. Not yet." He turned to the rest of the crew. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're getting out of here, no matter what." But before anyone could respond, the comms crackled to life. Sarah's voice came through, steady as ever. "Captain, they're not done yet. They've planted more explosives on the lower decks. You're going to need to move faster than that if you plan to get out in one piece." Hayes glanced at the tactical display, his mind racing. "I'll get the crew ready. You hold them off as long as you can. We're going to make this count." Sarah, now on the move once again, adjusted her strategy. She had already accomplished more than anyone thought possible, but the fight was far from over. The Empire thought they had this battle won, but they had underestimated her, just like they had underestimated humanity. And now she was going to make sure they remembered that mistake. As Sarah dropped another soldier with surgical precision, she felt the weight of the fight settling in. She had given everything to this moment, but she wasn't about to let the Empire walk away with a victory. Not today. Not ever. The chaos inside the Vanguard had reached its peak. The Empire's forces had breached nearly every deck, and Sarah could feel the walls of the ship closing in around her. Every corner held a threat now, every sound a potential danger. The Empire was relentless, and while her shots had struck fear into their ranks, their numbers were too great. She couldn't keep this up forever. Her pulse rifle clicked empty, and she quickly holstered it, unslinging the sidearm from her belt. Her fingers were slick with sweat, but her focus remained absolute. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her crew, for humanity's dignity, and for something much larger than a single battle. The Vanguard couldn't fall today. Just as she crouched behind another set of crates, a squad of Empire soldiers rounded the corner, and Sarah didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon, but before she could take the first shot, a sudden explosion rocked the ship, throwing her off balance. The floor beneath her trembled violently, and the corridor she had just been using as cover was engulfed in flames. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. They'd hit the lower levels, Hen. The comms crackled in her ear. "Sergeant, we got to go." Now, Hayes' voice was tight with urgency. The ship groaned under the weight of the Empire's assault, and Sarah could hear the deep rumbling of the breaches as the fire spread through the lower decks. The Vanguard was on its last legs. Hayes wasn't just talking about retreat. He was talking about survival. "Understood," Sarah replied, her voice calm but determined. She moved swiftly, calculating her next steps. The Empire's forces had grown more cautious, knowing they were nearing their goal. But Sarah had a plan. She wasn't done yet. She knew the layout of the Vanguard better than anyone, and there was one thing the Empire didn't know. Sarah had already planted explosives in the ship's critical systems. The Empire had made one last critical mistake. They assumed they were close enough to overpower her, but Sarah had been planning her escape for this moment. She wasn't just going to let them take the Vanguard. She was going to make sure it cost them everything. She sprinted through the halls, taking calculated shots as she moved, making sure the Empire soldiers were kept off balance. When she reached the lower decks, she accessed the ship's command systems. Her hands were steady as she keyed in the sequence. The countdown began. "Captain, prepare for detonation," she said, her voice cool and commanding. On the bridge, Hayes knew what she meant. He had already given the order to begin the evasive maneuvers, but the crew couldn't leave just yet. They had one final desperate task ahead. "Everyone, brace yourselves. This is going to be tight," Hayes shouted as the Vanguard suddenly lurched forward. They were pulling away from the Empire's grasp, just barely. The countdown on Sarah's device was ticking down, and as it neared the final seconds, she felt a pang of regret, not for herself, but for the men and women who had given their lives for this cause. It had been worth it. Humanity had proved its worth. They had stood their ground. And now, they would leave the Empire with a message it would never forget. The final moment arrived. Sarah pressed the button. The ship shook with the force of the explosion as a massive fireball erupted from the Vanguard's core. The shockwave rippled outward, hitting the Empire's transports with catastrophic force. The Vanguard wasn't just a warship, it was a weapon of destruction, and with that final act, it had ensured that the Empire would pay dearly for every life it had taken. From space, the Vanguard was a spectacle, blinding light against the dark backdrop of the galaxy. The remnants of the ship fragmented, but in that moment, Sarah's mission was clear. She had ensured the Empire's defeat, even if the battle had cost them dearly. The remaining Empire forces on the ground, disoriented by the explosion, were now cut off from their escape routes. The destruction of the Vanguard left them stranded and helpless. The remaining crew of the Vanguard was making its way toward the escape pods, but the Empire's reputation had already been shattered. Sarah, though exhausted, felt a quiet satisfaction. The Empire had mocked them, underestimated them, and now they were facing the consequences. And humanity. Humanity had made a statement. As Sarah made her way toward the escape pods, she glanced back at the remains of the Vanguard. The ship had served its purpose. Humanity had proven, once again, that they were a force to be reckoned with. The war wasn't over, but it was a pivotal moment in the galactic struggle. And Sarah Lawson, the sniper who had made it all possible, would be remembered as the spark that set the galaxy ablaze.